the so-called right opposition, or as they called themselves abroad, the international communist opposition in the realm of factional activities was more of a foreign phenomenon. We have already spoken about how, in the USA, elements of the former party leadership were ejected from the mainstream movement and how they went on to form a parallel movement. But this was not a one-time occurrence. In various other communist parties across Europe, and even in India, there were several other communist opposition parties that comprised the elements of the former party leadership. These ejected members and their communist opposition parties would oppose the Comintern line as it entered the third period. These parties, for the most part, tended to be loyal oppositions, however, and still extolled and defended the USSR in their publications, just outside of the communist mainstream. We'll start with the most well-known of the communist opposition parties, Bloque, Obero y Campesino, which is perhaps more recognizable as one of the parties that made up the Partito Obrero de Unificación Marxista, or the P.O.U.M, in 1935. Between the BOC and the party it fused with, Izquierda Comunista de España, or ICE, ICE. The BOC, led by Joaquín Marín, was the larger faction. The Bloc, and later the P.O.U.M, interestingly, was actually larger and more important than the official Spanish Communist Party, before the Civil War would inflate the latter's membership and importance. Like the American Communist movement, the Communist movement in Spain was wrought with factionalism. Robert Alexander paints the picture. At the inception of the communist opposition in Spain, the country's labor and political left were badly divided. After World War I, the Communist Party divided the left labor forces. The party drew its first cadres both from the socialist UGT ranks and the CNT. Those communists who were later to form the Bloque, Obero y Campesino came mainly from the latter group. The Communist Party was marked by factionalism from the beginning. Two different communist parties first emerged from the dissident elements of the Partido Socialista Obrero Español. The Comintern sent Jules Humbert Dros, its Latin secretary, to Spain to bring these factions into a single party, which he finally succeeded in doing. However, factionalism continued to characterize Spanish communism. In 1923, during Primo de Rivera's dictatorship, the PCE neutered itself so that it could remain legal. Joaquín Marín had represented the Catalan Federation of the PCE. He had been active in the labor movement for some time and held considerable prestige. He was opposed to the policy of the party leadership, and in November, a party plenum had forced the resignation of the Spanish Communist Party's leadership. Marín himself would take control. During Marín's tenure as party leader, he built up the PCE's underground organization and began attacking the regime in the party's illegal newspaper, Vanguardia. In 1925, Marín and many of the PCE's top leadership were arrested, and after spending a few years in prison, he got deported to France. In Marín's absence, the Comintern appointed a new leadership for the PCE, which undertook its Bolshevization. Furthermore, Moscow would order the Spanish Communist Party to join the consultative assembly that was about to be established by Primo de Rivera, as well as to take a more passive policy against the regime. Marín opposed this conciliatory policy and advocated for continued agitation and for the continuation of underground and illegal activity. While Marín was in exile, the PCE leadership labeled him as a Rightist and attacked him and his policies. They worked to undermine him and even prevented him from attending the party's third Congress in France by arguing that since he was living in France now, he was not a member of the PCE but of the PCF. Marín's Catalan Federation and by extension Marín himself would be expelled from the party. Following this, the Federation would merge with the dissident PCC in 1931. This union resulted in the creation of two organizations. First was the Federación Comunista Catalano-Balear, which renamed itself to the Federación Comunista Ibérica the next year. The second organization was the BOC, but according to Robert Alexander, these two groups tended to become one and the same over time. Marín's new party argued that Spain required a bourgeois democratic revolution that was carried out by the working class, and since the bloc was primarily based out of Catalonia, it also called for Catalan independence as well as independence for Spanish Morocco. Despite being outside the official communist movement, like the American Party, the bloc still considered itself loyal to the USSR, loyal but critical of the policies that they felt were harming the movement. In 1931, after the death of Primo de Rivera, and by extension his dictatorship the year prior, the Spanish monarchy would collapse. From here, the bloc and the Spanish left as a whole began their political ascendancy within Catalonia and Spain. Paying close attention to events occurring in Spain, Humbert Dros would write to Moscow that contrary to the claims of the Spanish Communist Party, the bloc was not disintegrating, but growing. Robert Alexander writes, "With the fall of King Alfonso XIII, Colonel Francisco Macia, the leader of the Esquerra Català party, proclaimed the existence of the Catalan Republic on April 13, 1931. Shortly afterwards, the Bloc sent a delegation of armed members to the seat of the new Catalan Republican government. It was reported that, quote, they installed themselves as a guard. They feared a reaction by the police or the army, and weren't convinced that the Esquerra would be willing to fight. The intense activity of the Bloc paid off quickly. Within 2 months of proclamation of the Republic, its membership had doubled to between 13 and 1,400. The circulation of La Battaglia rose from 3,000 to 30,000, and subsequently leveled off at about 7,000. The Bloc was an interesting group. Its members were primarily working class, but to be a member, you also had to have quite a specific set of views. According to Victor Alba, to fully adhere to the Bloc, you had to be communist, but outside of the Communist International, revolutionary, and working class, but defending at the moment the need for a bourgeois democratic revolution, part of the Republic, but trying to prevent people from having illusions about it, Marxist, and therefore opposed to anarchism, but working inside the CNT, internationalist, but defending the rights of nationalities and of self-determination, not entirely as contradictory as the quote suggests, as communists understand the specific moment or stage of history that they are in. Still, these requirements were rather specific. Victor Alba, who Robert Alexander cites, states that being a member of the Bloc was more than just an activity or a job, it was a way of life. The Bloc had various subsections, such as its own theater and a women's organization. The Bloquistas also ran a youth group and a defense section that was designed to protect its members during meetings or whenever they put up posters. Apparently, the main people which the Bloc had to defend themselves from were the official communists. During the 1932 Catalan parliament elections, the Bloc received 12,000 votes in Catalonia, while the official communists could only muster 1,000. Following electoral gains amongst the Spanish right, in November 1933, the Bloc formed a bloc with the Catalan section of the PSOE for the local election. Following the standard communist opposition line, the Bloc attempted to gain influence amongst the trade union movement. They acquired control of some unions in Barcelona and had a faction within the CNT before it was expelled. The Bloc organized the peasantry as well. They established 2 groups, the Unió Agraria and the Acció Social Agraria, with 18,000 and 12,000 members respectively. When the other communist opposition parties were expelled from the official movement, they tried fruitlessly to regain entry. Unlike the other groups, the Communist International was actually interested in reabsorbing the P.O.U.M back into its ranks. They made several overtures to Marín and the Bloc. Robert Alexander writes, the first attempt to win back the Bloc was taken by Jules Humbert Dros. He has noted that, quote, in Barcelona, I re-established contact with the dissident party of the Marín, where there were several comrades in whom I had confidence, but my efforts, supported by the delegation, were not sufficient to re-establish unity. Subsequently, the political bureau of the Spanish party issued an invitation to the members of the Bloc to return. Humbert Dros suggested that Marín and the others go to Moscow to discuss the matter. Marín refused, fearing that once he was in Moscow, the Comintern would prevent his return, thus decapitating the communist opposition in Spain. The final maneuver was an attempt by the official party to appeal over Marín's head to the members of his party. Mundo Obrero, the official party's weekly, published an invitation to Bloc members in June 1931, which, while denouncing Marín, noted that the Central Committee of the Communist Party issues you a warm call to return to our ranks, and declares that it is disposed to admit you in Bloc on the basis of acceptance without reservations of the program and the political line of the Communist International and its Spanish section. Needless to say, virtually no one accepted this invitation. The Bloc considered itself loyal to the Soviet Union, but not subject to it. They had their differences with the official communists, and thus could not unite with them. According to the Bloc, quote, communism will not be able to win the leadership of the working class unless it is the direct fruit of the Iberian historic reality, and not a standardized model subject to bureaucratic direction completely extraneous to our revolution. The Spanish Revolution has to be made by the Spanish workers. Revolutionary colonialism is disastrous for the march of the revolution. Thus, much like Lovestone's party, the Bloc argued that the Bloc had to follow a line which was determined by the conditions actually existing in their country, and not to go the route determined by Moscow. Following the German disaster in 1934, which saw the rise of Hitler and the complete obliteration of one of the largest communist movements in the world, and the largest communist movement in Europe, the Bloc began to push even harder for the establishment of a united front in Spain. The Bloc would find success with the formation of the Alianza Obrera in November 1933. All in all, the groups that the Alianza Obrera consisted of were the Federación Sindicalística Libertaria, the expelled unions of the CNT, the Catalan UGT, the Partito Sindicalística, the Catalan Federation of the Spanish Socialist Party, the Unió Socialista de Catalunya, Andreu Nin's Izquierda Comunista, the Unió Rabasades, and various CNT opposition unions. This initial united front saw success in a walkout strike in Catalonia. Throughout Spain, this idea would catch on, and numerous other worker alliances were formed in Spain's other cities throughout the years. At first, the official communists were opposed to this united front idea, and instead formed their own groups. But just a few months later, they switched their position and joined in on local worker alliances formations. In October 1934, a national general strike was called in reaction to the entry of the CETA into the government. However, in the Asturias and Catalonia, the local United Front strikes evolved into a revolt. In Catalonia, the revolution was a confused affair that went down without a fight, despite the fact that various groups involved were armed to the teeth and had control of various local administrative institutions. But in the Asturias, the revolt was a lot more organized, and the socialist element in the region succeeded in taking and holding territory for 2 weeks before government forces bloodily suppressed the revolutionary movement. A revolt had been planned in Valencia, but was cancelled because of the failure of the Catalan movement. As a result of the Catalan revolt's failure, the Bloc sought to take its united front tactic and have it operate on the national level rather than with disconnected local groupings in this or that city. But because of attacks on the labor movement, they had trouble in establishing such a national workers' alliance. At the same time, in 1935, the Popular Front movement would take off and completely displace the Bloc's plan. From here, the Bloc discussed its next move, which was forming a broad coalition of revolutionary Marxists. The Bloc was offered by the PSOE to merge with it. The Bloc refused, and instead, the PSOE would merge with the official communists. The Bloc would instead join with Andreu Nin in the Izquierda Comunista de España. Andreu Nin had previously been a supporter of Bukharin, but began supporting Trotsky in 1930. He was a personal friend of Marin and had defended him when the Comintern was attacking him in the 1920s. Even as a Trotskyist, Nin had cordial relations with the Bloc until Trotsky ordered them and the Spanish Trotskyists to break with them. In 1934, Nin and his group would break with Trotsky over the entryism tactic that he was pushing. For the longest time, I used to believe that the P.O.U.M was a Trotskyist organization, but this is just not true. Before Nin's communists joined the Bloc, they had only a few hundred members. The so-called right-wing Bukharinist faction had more sway and more members in the P.O.U.M than the Trotskyists did. The Bloc as a whole was the most successful of all of the right opposition parties, and the only one to militarize. The new P.O.U.M, according to Victor Alba, included practically all of the founders of the original Spanish Communist Party. The P.O.U.M was not a member of the International Communist Opposition, but associated with its members, and the relationship of the ICO to the P.O.U.M was of friendly criticism and enthusiasm. The P.O.U.M, just like all the other communist opposition parties, were opposed to the Popular Front tactic, but the situation that was occurring in Spain forced them to act contrary to their political convictions, and on the 1st of January 1936, they applied to join the Popular Front. The official communists were opposed to their entry, but the socialists in the Popular Front overrode their decision, and the P.O.U.M would join with the rest of the left in the Popular Front on January 8, 1936. However, only a few months later, the P.O.U.M would withdraw from the Popular Front, and according to Robert Alexander, the reason that Marin exited the Popular Front was because he explained that in his opinion, the People's Front had been an election bloc, and that as such had lost its significance for the working class after the elections. The majority of the election bloc, he continued, is in favor of parliamentary action only. The main task of the proletariat today, however, is to concentrate on extra-parliamentary activities. It is prevented from doing so by its alliance with the petty bourgeoisie. When Manuel Azaña was elected to be the president of Spain on June 16th, Marin would criticize him for not carrying out the Popular Front program. He argued that the Spanish state needed to nationalize land, banks, and implement progressive measures, or else, quote, within 2 months, we shall see the most intense counter-revolution, and perhaps then it will be too late to contain the outrages of fascism, of which there is more danger than perhaps we in these seats understand. Marin would be off by only 1 month, because the Francoist insurrection would take place first in Morocco and then in the rest of Spain in the middle of July. In Catalonia, the P.O.U.M and the CNT took to the streets and fought off the coup attempt there, and when the Comité de Milicias was formed a few days later, the P.O.U.M would have one representative, Josep Rovira, on the committee. However, when all of this was occurring, Marin was no longer the leader of the P.O.U.M, because on July 19th, he had traveled to Coruna in Galicia in northwest Spain, where he had planned to give a speech. The next day, the soldiers in the city revolted, and Marin was captured and arrested. The Pumistas believed that he had been dead, even announcing this as a fact in their newspaper. Shortly afterwards, Andrzej Nin was chosen as their new leader. But ironically, in a similar situation to Władysław Gomułka in Poland, Marin's life would be saved as a result of his imprisonment by fascists, while his followers in the P.O.U.M, who should have been safe behind communist lines, were subject to hostility from the official communists, and in the next few months, they were hunted down, imprisoned, and murdered by them during the course of the Civil War. The Pumistas were denounced as Trotskyists and agents of fascism, their press was banned, and the same socialists who tried to incorporate them into their own party a year prior now joined with the official communists in attacking them as Trotskyists who were opposed to unity. Robert Alexander writes, "All the attacks on the P.O.U.M in this period were not verbal. In March, La Battaglia was suppressed for 4 days for not having observed the norms of the censorship. Victor Alba has noted that of all the Pumista press outside of Catalonia, El Comunista of Valencia is the only periodical which could publish. Juventud Roja, organ of the JCI Valencia, was suspended because the censor left it practically in blank. Even in the military field, the official communists sabotaged the Pumistas." Victor Alba has written, "On February 23rd, there is an operation ordered from Barblasto of the 29th Division of the P.O.U.M against Vivel del Rio, which the forces of the PSUC should support from the flanks, but it didn't give the support, making the plan fail. The communists used every setback they were able to inflict on the P.O.U.M as proof of their charges that it was fascist. For instance, when the junta of Madrid suppressed the Pumista press of the capital through communist pressure, which in Madrid was irresistible, the communist periodicals said that the decision of the junta demonstrated that the P.O.U.M was fascist, since if this were not so, how could one imagine that periodicals would be suspended?" In 1937, the conflict between the P.O.U.M and the official communists worsened, and in May that year, anarchists in Barcelona who were opposed to ending the social revolution rose in arms. The anarchists were joined later by the P.O.U.M. In the aftermath, the anarchists who started the uprising were untouched, but the P.O.U.M was outlawed. Andrzej Nin was arrested and murdered by the official communists. The story of his demise is still shrouded in mystery. The NKVD agent who was responsible for detaining Nin and played a leading role in suppressing the P.O.U.M, Leon Narvitz, was assassinated by Trotskyists in Barcelona in 1938. The other leaders of the P.O.U.M were arrested and put on trial, accused of joining a counter-revolutionary plot with the Phalangists. They were sentenced to several years in jail. After 1938, some elements of the P.O.U.M still existed underground, but after its suppression, it ceased to operate in any military function. In Germany, the KPD, just like in all communist parties, was dealing with major factional struggles. From 1925 to 1928, Ernst Thälmann, with the direct intervention of Bukharin himself in 1926, displaced and expelled the left, Fischer-Maslov leadership, and their followers. From then on, he and Heinz Neumann would lead the German Communist Party. During this period, the party had two major opposition trends. The Brandler-Thalheimer group, which previously led the KPD after 1920, when they for a time replaced Paul Levi, who himself resigned from party leadership and then was expelled from the KPD for criticizing the failure of the March action in his book Unser Weg wider den Putschismus. Heinrich Brandler and August Thalheimer were themselves replaced in 1923 after they were scapegoated by Zinoviev for the failure of the Hamburg uprising, after which Ruth Fischer became party leader and enacted its Bolshevization. In November 1928, Ernst Thälmann was caught up in a scandal when he attempted to cover up the embezzlement of funds by his brother-in-law, who was a party secretary in the Hamburg branch. Eventually, a German Comintern functionary would discover what happened and presented the evidence to the Central Committee of the KPD. The KPD's Central Committee, along with Thälmann himself, voted unanimously to suspend him and Vittorf from their positions in the party. But in a stroke of good fortune for Thälmann, Stalin himself personally intervened. Literally 1 day after the decision of the KPD Central Committee was published, an emissary from Moscow arrived with a message from Stalin condemning the decision of the German Central Committee and ordering the restoration of Thälmann to his post. Robert Alexander describes the aftermath of this very blatantly corrupt event. The Thälmann-Vittorf affair precipitated a general crisis in the leadership of the KPD. On November 10, 1928, the Brandler-Thalheimer group issued a call for a meeting of its followers to launch a fight against the corruption of the leadership of the KPD and the International. They also began to publish a periodical, Gegen den Strom. These actions provoked an open letter from the Presidium of the Executive Committee of the Comintern against both Brandler and Thalheimer. In January 1929, both men were formally expelled from the Comintern and from the German and Soviet parties to which they belonged. As a result, the factional meeting which took place on December 30th, 1928, became in fact the founding congress of a new group, the Communist Party of Germany Opposition, KPO, the first such national group to be formally established. Many members of the KPO had been longtime members of the socialist movement. Brandler and Thalheimer were founding members of the KPD and had been elected to several high positions in the party and the Comintern before their inglorious fall. Paul Fröhlich was a member of the Bremen Left and established the newspaper Rote Fahne, while his wife, Rosie Wolfstein, was a close friend of Rosa Luxemburg, a member of the Spartacus League and a delegate to the KPD's founding Congress. Clara Zetkin, while not being a member of the KPO, apparently greatly sympathized with the group. She made no secret of her views. She voted against the expulsion of Brandler and Thalheimer in the Comintern Executive Committee, and even contributed articles to their opposition paper against the current. Zetkin, according to the Lovestonite Ben Gitlow, was critical of Stalin's actions against Bukharin, and she openly stated her disagreements with the Comintern's actions in the German Communist Party. The KPO itself was founded from the 1,000 or so members of the KPD that were expelled in January 1929. It worked also to recruit new members, who were mostly former KPD members. Much like the Lovestoneites in the USA, the KPO was against the formation of a second party. In their eyes, their purpose was to save the KPD and the Comintern as a whole from the ultra-left course that it was taking. They feared that their new policies would have disastrous consequences for the movement in Germany and abroad. According to M.N. Roy, by the end of the year, the KPO had 6,000 due-paying members, thousands more sympathizers than the KPD, and was issuing multiple weekly and monthly publications, and in 1930 they would issue a daily that went by Arbeiterpolitik. In the political domain, the KPO was active in protesting against the Young Plan. They sometimes also ran their own candidates in electoral campaigns, but during the 1932 election, they supported Ernst Thälmann and criticized the Social Democrats for backing Hindenburg. Characteristic of the quote-unquote right-wing communist parties at this time, they worked in unions and advocated for a united front. Again, like the Lovestoneites in the USA, the KPO would undergo a split on whether or not to maintain themselves as an opposition or whether to emerge as an entirely new communist party. This view was held by a minority of the group, led by Paul Fröhlich, who made overtures with the SAP for a fusion of their groups. Brandler and Thalheimer opposed this, and the minority group was expelled, and subsequently went to join the SAP anyway. The KPO would attack both the SPD and the KPD for their mutual refusal to work with each other. With the Social Democrats, they denounced them for preferring to maintain the capitalist state over forming a united front, while with the KPD, they criticized them for continuing to slander non-communist socialists as social fascist. The KPO called such terminology ultra-left nonsense. When Hitler came to power in 1933, the organizations of both the Communists and the Social Democrats were destroyed. Many communists were sent to prisons or concentration camps. Despite the open terror against them, those communists that did remain still involved themselves in underground resistance. The KPO, for its part, published clandestine literature that was pocket-sized so that it could be hidden and encouraged workers in factories to slow down production. The struggle, however, was difficult because of the Nazi repression. Many KPO members, despite the group itself avoiding the infiltration that the KPD had suffered, still wound up getting arrested, beaten, and imprisoned. The KPO stayed underground and still managed to operate as late as 1938. An American Lovestoneite actually worked as a courier, helping the small groups of the KPO, separated from one another, maintain contact. The last place where the KPO operated legally was in the Saar Valley in 1935. At that time, the region was controlled by the League of Nations. In January of 1935, there was a plebiscite that was held on the future of the region. The local Nazis advocated for reunification with Germany. The Communists and the Social Democrats advocated for maintaining the status quo, and other groups advocated for annexation by France. But the KPO, quite uncharacteristically, advocated its own platform, that of the creation of a Soviet Saar independent of France, Germany, and the League of Nations. When the Comintern started pushing the Popular Front tactic, Thalheimer, who was in exile in Paris, stated that, quote, "The communist opposition categorically rejects such a flagrant abandonment of basic communist tasks in the coming revolution. We maintain that such a coalition is incompatible with the preparation of the proletarian revolution, and that the alliance of the working class with petty bourgeois elements cannot be realized through a coalition with bourgeois parties or groups, but only through the formation of united front organs against the bourgeois opposition groups, united front organs which must develop into Soviets." During the Spanish Civil War, KPO members went to Spain and joined their counterpart, the P.O.U.M, but as they arrived in Spain, they ended up getting arrested by the Republican government, which was waging its war against the P.O.U.M. The KPO in France protested against the arrest of its members, but did not agree with the anti-Stalinism espoused by the P.O.U.M. According to Victor Alba, He remembers Heinrich Brandler shouting at Andrei Unin because he, quote, opposed having the Bureau condemn the Moscow trials. Brandler would even advise the P.O.U.M to not to be as anti-Stalinist as they had been. Even in exile, the KPO could not help but be a communist party and would suffer yet another split over the question of Stalinism. After the fall of France, the KPO ceased to exist as an organized group. Brandler and Thalheimer would escape to Cuba. After the war, Brandler would return to Germany in hopes that he could reconcile himself with the official communist movement. He was unable to, and instead, he founded the Gruppe Arbeiterpolitik. This organization would follow in the traditions of the KPO. And actually, it's still around today. You can even visit their website right now. In Switzerland, the notable communist militant Jules Humbert Droz inspired the Swiss communists to oppose the Comintern line, but he himself always remained loyal to the Comintern, despite his criticism of its policy, such as its constant interference in the affairs of the KPD and the reinstatement of Ernst Thälmann. Humbert Droz stayed committed to the line of the Comintern, even though he disagreed with it, because he felt it was the duty of a communist to follow the principles of democratic centralism. But opposition of any kind clearly wasn't allowed in the Comintern. He was jostled around the world, first being sent to Argentina, then to Spain, then back to Switzerland to run the Swiss Communist Party, but he was eventually expelled in 1943. But prior to then, the Swiss Communist Party's leadership had already taken up a position of supporting Bukharin, although they were unaware of the situation which was brewing in Moscow. Even though Humbert Droz never joined the international communist opposition, many of his associates did after they were expelled from the party in 1929 for supporting him. These old associates would go on to form the Swiss Communist Opposition, which Robert Alexander describes as follows. The new leadership went on to purge those members who still maintained the positions which Humbert Droz, Wieser, and others had in 1928 to 1929. Most outstanding was Walter Bringolf, Humbert Droz's fellow delegate to the Second Congress of the Comintern, and the party's principal figure in the Schaffhausen region. He controlled a party paper in that city and was ordered by the new party leadership to turn it over to them. He went to Moscow in mid-1929 to ask Humbert Droz what to do. As might be expected, Humbert Droz advised Bringolf to do as the party leadership demanded and to turn over the paper. However, Bringolf did not take Humbert Droz's advice. Instead, he pulled the Schaffhausen branch out of the Communist Party and formed the Communist Party opposition. The Swiss CPO was small, but it was well concentrated in Schaffhausen and Neuhausen. It was actually the largest party in that area. During municipal elections, they received almost more votes than every other bourgeois party combined. The CPO even managed to elect one of its members as the mayor in Schaffhausen. Once more, like all of the communist opposition parties, the CPO was against the formation of a new party. When Humbert Droz was reinstated as the party's leader, the CPO made attempts to rejoin the main party, something which Humbert Droz was willing to accept. However, the Comintern denounced this, and instead, the CPO integrated with the Swiss Socialist Party and became a component of its left wing. When Humbert Droz was expelled from the Swiss Communist Party, he too would join the Socialist Party. The communist opposition existed in all of the Scandinavian countries as well. While in Denmark and Norway, the opposition was relatively small and wielded little influence. In Finland, according to Robert Alexander, they were a force to be reckoned with. But with Sweden, basically, the entire party joined the opposition and therefore was larger than the official Communist Party. The Swedish Communist Party, which was the name of the opposition party as they retained the name following their expulsion, was different from other communist parties in that it was financially independent of Moscow. When the Comintern was entering the third period, the leadership of the SKP were criticized at the 6th Congress of the Comintern. They were informed by a German in Stalin's camp named Hermann Remmele that Sweden, in 1929, was an imperialist power that was preparing for war with the USSR. The party leadership obviously protested against this new thesis because it was fucking stupid and quite baseless, but the Comintern persisted in its claims and pushed for the SKP to adopt this new line. Within the SKP, two factions developed, the pro-Moscow group and the SKP leadership. Robert Alexander describes the situation as such. As this controversy was developing, Hugo Sillen emerged as leader of the pro-Moscow elements. The issue of how the international role of Sweden should be categorized remained a major question. As August Spangberg has said, the Sillen group wanted the party to characterize Sweden as an imperialist nation preparing for war against the Soviet Union, and to insist that the Social Democrats took an active part in this planning. The Kilborn group stated that Sweden was to be viewed as a neutral country not planning to wage war with any nation, and that the Social Democrats indeed were against anything like that. When the SKP faction in the Riksdag introduced a bill calling for dissolution of Swedish armed forces, Sillin denounced it as, quote, causing confusion within the ranks of the working class, because it didn't mention, quote, the preparations of the Swedish bourgeoisie to start a war with the Soviet Union, or the, quote, deceitful action of the Social Democrats in using disarmament as a link in the planning of war with the Soviet Union. The SKP leadership was attacked for a variety of things. The internal workings of the SKP were attacked. They were attacked for having bills which they introduced getting passed by Parliament. They were attacked for their trade union policy. And most hilarious of all, they were attacked for canceling their May Day parade because of a snowstorm. The Sillin group stated that, quote, how can a party, not able to cope with a snowstorm, lead a revolution? In the Comintern, it was determined that the party leadership had been pursuing the wrong policy for years because they had apparently completely mischaracterized Swedish capitalism. A takeover of the party was organized by the Comintern, but it failed, and rather than the usual case where a minority was expelled, in fact, the majority of the party would go over to join the opposition. This was one of the rare cases in which the opposition movement not only was larger than the official communist one, but also more successful. At the outset of the so-called split, the P.O.U.M majority group still considered themselves as a part of the Comintern and retained the name Communist Party of Sweden, section of the Communist International. But in 1932, during the controversy that the ICO went through over whether or not to remain oppositionists or to form a completely separate entity, the Swedish opposition would split from the rest of the international communist opposition. By 1934, the SKP simply went by Socialist Party, and while they still supported the USSR, they denounced its leadership, unlike the other opposition communist parties. During Swedish provincial elections, the SKP, later called Socialist Party, gained more votes than the Comintern-aligned party in some areas of the country, while in others, the official group got more. Still, less combined than the rival Social Democratic Party. For example, in the 1932 general election, the oppositionists received 132,000 votes, or 5% of the vote, while the official group gained 74,000 votes, or 3% of the vote. Combined, they would have received over 200,000 votes and 8 seats, but the party which won the election, the Social Democrats, received 1 million votes and got 104 seats. For the first decade, the opposition group was stronger than the official communists, but by 1938, the opposition movement lost its steam, and for the first time, the official movement gained more votes than they did. It was in 1940 when the party ceased to be relevant. One interesting and jarring fact about Niels Flegg, one of the leaders of the communist opposition, is that during World War II, he took up a pro-Nazi stance while still retaining his socialist views. When the Swedish communist opposition turned into the Socialist Party, its two leaders, P.O.U.M and Flegg, began to have conflicts. Eventually, P.O.U.M was expelled, but like with the Communist Party, after he left the Socialist Party, so did the majority of the Socialist Party. When the war broke out, Flegg denounced the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact as well as fascism, but when Hitler invaded the Soviet Union, he came out in support of the Nazis. There were also communist opposition parties in Canada, France, Hungary, Austria, Mexico, and the communist opposition in Czechoslovakia was actually quite large, but apparently faltered due to splits. Lastly, in the Alsace-Lorraine region, there was a communist opposition party, but strangely, this party became pro-Nazi after some time. What's interesting about these so-called right opposition communist parties is that although they have been called right-wing and quote-unquote Bukharinist, they completely supported Soviet foreign and economic policy under Stalin. These parties were only right-wing on strategy in their respective countries. They were by no means 100% Bukharin devotees, in the same manner that the international left opposition were Trotskyists. All of these communist opposition parties, with the P.O.U.M as an exception, were basically your typical 1930s era Marxist-Leninists, with the only difference being that they supported the United Front and working in trade unions. Apparently, however, this completely insignificant tactical heresy was enough to have these people completely ejected from mainstream communism and dubbed as counter-revolutionaries forever. All in all, once more, basically, all of the communist opposition parties, with the exception of the P.O.U.M, were loyal to the Comintern and to the Soviet Union. In their eyes, they were still a part of the communist movement, but it took them years to finally understand that this was not the case, and that the Comintern did not want them. The communist opposition differed very little from the official communists, and even less after the Comintern dropped its sectarian practices and supported open alliances with bourgeois parties. These people have been and still are dubbed to be Rightist, but that glaringly overstates the extent of their supposed deviation. In fact, the so-called right deviation was simply the original line of the Comintern before its pivot in 1929. If there was a deviation, it was one to the left. Furthermore, by the time that the Popular Front period came around, the Comintern had moved further to the right than the so-called Rightist. Using right and left to constrain political affiliations of communists is just as silly, in my opinion, as using them to describe political affiliations in general. The formation of the international communist opposition is an interesting and under-discussed moment in communist history. However, very little came of it, especially due to their unceasing loyalty to a movement that rejected them. There is not much to learn from these groups, other than that sometimes sticking to your principles gets you killed.